I made a post a few days ago and it got a lot of feedback. Most of it was positive. A few people reached out to me asking me what apps do I use, what are my camera settings, and how do I edit my photos. And I've always tried to explain this, but it's difficult without giving a visual representation of what you're doing. So this video is going to be a breakdown of my editing procedure. And if you have any comments, please leave them in the comment section. What's up everybody, this is Victory and welcome to Neophyte's Paradise. This page is of course aimed to provide you with cheaper options or easier options for content creation, and also trying to help all the creatives out there who are like me, who are trying to do things on a budget. Without wasting much of your time, let's get straight into the edits. So this is the image we have to work with today. I would say okay, so these are the settings we have, and if you notice there's a bit of fringing. We will handle this later. There's a lot of green fringing and chromatic aberration, but first of all, what I like to do is I like to change my color profile to landscape. This gives me more rich tones when it comes to colors. I feel like when dealing especially with black people, it gives me richer skin tones, and so I can skip the color grading procedure by simply just selecting this landscape. We go to our basic exposure. We want to correct a few things, and so maybe tone up my exposure to 50. I would like to have a bit more contrast in my image. You'd like to play down the highlights a bit. And the shadows, I would like to increase this significantly. This gives me more room for something to work with later on. I would explain. And if we're toning down the whites a bit, the blacks, of course, we need to bring down the blacks to give that rich black tone that we want, and to kind of fade away the background to really make the background obsolete. The texture here, we're going to subtract the texture because the image is really sharp, so we get it as unsharp as possible but not destroying the image, and we would like to dehaze the image a bit. So you see, just with this basic touches, we have already been able to get our image to be more dramatic. Unfortunately, the saturation, the colors are overly saturated, so we're going to bring down the saturation a bit, but we want to still maintain the vibrance. So I think by a similar amount we bring up the vibrance, and so this is what we have. So this is before, after, before, after. Good. And so since I already mentioned, by simply choosing the landscape profile, I have saved myself the stress of doing all of these. So I'm going to go straight to optics, and I would remove chromatic aberration, use profile correction. However, this does not necessarily handle the fringing. So if you notice, there's a lot of green fringing here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to expand the zone for my green. So here, I would say from here to here, then if we increase our green by, you see, by 3 already, see all the green fringing disappear. So we have handled the green fringing problem, but now we have the purple fringing problem, which is also something else. And so by simply adjusting the zone which affects your fringe control and then increasing, we can see a significant decrease at this point. So this is before, after. And same thing with the green. You can see this is before and this is after. So that is how you can fix fringing on your images. So this is what I have to work with already. For my effects, I would add a bit of vignette to bring the concentration of my audience more to the center of my image, since that is where the face is, at the center, so I don't really mind about anything else. For my calibrations, I'm going to leave most of it as it is. The reds will be a bit slightly lesser red. I'll subtract the greens significantly more than the reds. And the blues, I think even more, since the fringe is closer to blues. So, but if you overdo it, then you have less balance in your skin textures. So you notice that this is what I have now already, and it already looks like a very good image. I would go to my color mixer, and here I would like to push my yellows a bit towards the orange, and my orange slightly among the yellows, and the red slightly towards the oranges. So it then gives me from a red image to a uniformly brown skin image. And same thing with the saturation. I want the reds to be a bit more saturated, but remember now the reds are more towards the orange, so I can saturate the red and the oranges without worrying for my image to become overly saturated. So this is already a very good look for me. I don't really think there's anything wrong with the luminance. Of course, you can always do more or less. So it's more of a personal choice right now. And I think this looks great. This looks okay for me. It's a very good base to work with. And when I'm done with all of that, the most or the next important thing or the next important step is, of course, the healing tool. I'm going to fast forward on all of this so you don't need to go through the entire process. Select heal. Your feather should be something around 16, maybe more. Opacity needs to be at 100. You can always have less, but I just prefer to keep it the way it is. You can alternatively still clone, but I just find the heal button more efficient to use. And so you just simply use it like that, I think. Now that we are done with this, this is the before and this is after. So just slightly healing the few spots that don't make sense, and the rest will be corrected later on when we will be doing our frequency separation. And so after this, the next and most important thing that I like to touch is I like to create a layer mask. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a subject. Adobe is very smart, so it knows exactly what to select. And while we are here, I'm going to choose from the presets that it's already in the app. I'm going to choose the eyes clearer. So the eyes clearer, because eye whitening is something that most people recognize only at the end of editing, whereas you can always fix that immediately. So first of all, the brightness of the eyes, exposure. I don't really set anything else here. The dark should be a bit darker, I think. I think this is okay. Yes, and now the temperature. This is the most important part, the temperature. What makes your eyes not white is the temperature of the eyes. So in this case, you don't want to do it too much. I think this is more than enough. And so you can already see what it looks before and what it looks after. So this is what the eyes look like after. If you do too much, then it doesn't look natural anymore. So I always end here. So this is what our image looks like now that we are editing. I'll quickly go and create 2 copies of the background. You can of course always use the shortcuts available. I'm kind of old school with it. So my low layer for my lower frequencies and my high layer for my higher frequencies. And so you select the low layer, uncheck the high layer, and what you want to do is apply a Gaussian blur effect. So Gaussian blur, I'm going to go with maybe 7. You can of course always control this and see how it affects your image, but I noticed that at a Gaussian blur of 7, I don't really have that much visible, but I can still smoothen things out. So I don't really see much of the textures visible at 7, so it's okay. So a Gaussian blur of 7, come to our higher layers, and you want to apply the image. So you go to image, apply image. And since this is a 16-bit image, what we're going to do is we're going to add and then invert with an 8-bit image. If you look up here, you would see this is 16-bit. With an 8-bit image, you would simply subtract the lower layers, but here you would add it and then invert it. So the inverse of addition is subtraction. So that is what we are doing here. That's the same logic here. And once you have that, you can come back here and select linear light. So creating this two into a group. Now we can call this our frequency separation, FreakSep for short. The name you give to it doesn't matter at all. Now we use a mixer brush tool. So look at the settings I have here. A clean brush, always a clean brush. This always check this option: custom, wetness 9, load 75%, mix 90%, flow 100%. And these are generally the settings I use. You can of course always change the inclination if you want to have more artistic control, but I'm not using a tablet, I'm using a mouse, so it wouldn't make any sense for me to use this. So what I come here is I uncheck the first layer and I just try to blend in the highlights first together. So blending them all together first of all. And you notice that this will also get rid of the dark spots on the skin. It would make the skin more uniform. So I would do this first. And you should generally not be afraid to zoom in to do all of this. So the more you zoom in, the more you can see what you're working with. I disable the first layer so that I can see how uniform I'm getting the textures. And so you try to find a blend between different texture groups. And so we get this right. And you try to follow the shape of the body part. So the shape of his skull, the shape of his hands, the shape of the nose, everything is important. So you try to pay attention to that when you're blending. This is actually blending the tones together. So that's what the mixer brush does. And so now you can see this is before, this is after. The problem with using the mixer brush is it kills a lot of the highlights, or it overblends most of the highlights. And so you find out that at the end you've lost most of your highlights, but not to worry, we can always reintroduce these. We will reintroduce these later on, and I'll show you how. So that brings us to our next step, which is the lasso tool. So we're going to use the lasso tool here. You're just going to select any parts of the skin or of the face. Here I'm going to select his skull, or his forehead, sorry. And we're going to use this forehead as a shape. And so remember that we had a value for our Gaussian blur. We had 7, so 7 by 3 should give us 21. And I mean, you can always go higher, 28. You see how smooth it becomes. But I think 21 is reasonable. You can also go lower if you can take values like 18. Then you notice also that how the strength of the smoothing. So I think 21 is good, 3 times the value you have. And same thing just applies for the other parts of the body. You want to also use that same blur effect so that it can be uniform all around. And just same thing, blur, apply the blur. Same thing here. Apply the blur. You notice that it takes away a lot of the highlights, and as I said, don't worry, we're going to introduce all of these back into the image. So with this Gaussian blur, with this, your selections don't have to exactly be 100% accurate, but you can always try to make them as good as possible. So this is what I have now. And for the nose, we are going to do a little technique to improve the shape of the nose. So we do this here. We do same or similar thing here. Same Gaussian blur. But now when we come to the center of the nose, we come to this part. When we come to this part, we are not going to apply the same blur. We are going to change the Gaussian blur. So instead of 21, we're going to use 18. And that is what we're going to use for the nose. So this is what our image looks like now. This is before, this is after, before, after. So once we're done with this, the next thing we go to is what I call dodge and burning, to reintroduce those highlights and those shadows that on the spots where we lost them. So for example, I can call this dodge, and I would make this layer transparent by pressing Ctrl I. I'm using a Windows computer. On a Mac it will be Windows I. I'm sorry, it will be the home button plus I. And yes, so this is what we are going to do. This is going to be our dodge, so we're going to make things brighter. You can look through it and you see that this is what it does. So that is what the layer looks like. And we create a similar curve layer again, and we call this burn. So dodge and burn. And the same thing here, we're going to burn. Burning means to make things darker. So of course, dark, we make it transparent, Ctrl I. And now that we have these two, we can create a group for them and call them dodge and burn. So D and B, dodge and burn. And so I'm going to make it more explicit so that you can see exactly what I do or how I do it. And so we want a brush, opacity 100, flow 100, and smoothing 10%. So we're going to start with dodge. So what I'm going to do is, where I had my highlights before, I'm just going to replace a bunch of lines, drawing out those highlights again, drawing out all the highlights here, here, at the edge of his head here, we had highlights. We had highlights reaching out to here too. The lines must not be perfectly straight, they must not be perfectly shaped. It's just to mark where the highlights were. And for the nose, you have to make sure that the line is as straight as you can get it. And then you notice that we had highlight patches here. We had highlight patches here. So we had line here. We had highlight on the lips too. Very important. You don't forget that you had a few highlight patches on the lips. So you're going to put it, of course, it looks a bit exaggerated right now, but not to worry. We will solve all of that later. So same way, all of these spots had highlights. So we are going to reintroduce all the highlights back again. And here there were highlights here in particular. Here too, there were highlights. And you would notice even on the jaw, the cheekbones, we had highlights. We had highlights that were shaped in this direction, like this, and we had highlights that were shaped in this direction too, giving it the cheek bone shape like this. And this is generally a summary of the highlights that we had. We never had too many highlights on his face since we were trying to get a dramatic look. So this is what the highlights look like. So these are the highlight spots on his face. And for the burn, you notice that the low lights, or rather the spots that were having the darker shadows, they are here. They are also very important when doing your dodge and burn. So of course we want his nose to stand out a bit. He's not a woman, so we will not make it too intense, but we're going to make it to be as straight as we can make it. So we get our darker spots here, we get some of this, some of that. And we generally see where our dark spots are, around the edges, around the jaws here. These were what made the jaws look very masculine and more chiseled. So of course, and around the nose here, we need those. We need a few here. And around the eyes, we had the darker spots here, here. We try not to create any bags. So this is typically what your highlights and your lowlights look like. I know now it looks like masquerade face or whatever, but we come now to dodge, we come to curves, and you simply take the feather up to maybe 170, and you've blended it perfectly. Same thing for burn, you go to curves, feather, let's say 160, 170. So that is dodge and burning. So this is before, this is after. This is before, this is after. If you feel like the strength is not enough, then you can always decrease the strength or increase it. I think this is okay for me. It's not too much, it's not too little. It's perfectly fine for me. And this specific image doesn't need a lot of retouching. So I would say that I did a lot when I was taking the picture. So I would advise you to learn about the exposure triangle before taking the pictures, and it will help you to minimize the work you have to do. Now with the curves, again, I'm going to raise this up as high as possible without destroying too much. So I'm going to name this eyes, and this is generally going to be for my eyes. Make it transparent, Control I. And so what I'm simply going to do is I get a white brush, I get a simple brush, white, and I come to the eyes and I paint. What this does is it brightens. Remember that in the raw filter we brightened only the sclera. Now we're brightening the pupil in a very easy and simple way. And like this, we have successfully been able to bring out more life in the eyes. So this is before, this is after. So you see the difference, and you can always increase or improve on how much you want it to look like. So if you were, I don't know, crazy for shiny eyes, but I think that's very, very overkill. So this is nice. And this is simply it. I think this is a breakdown of how I got this image. So you can simply look at the original image and the slight retouches that we did, and this is the final result. So it's really not as difficult as many people make it seem. And if you like this and you would like to have more videos like this, then let me know in the comment section. I would also be happy to do videos using the liquify tool on how you can reshape or resize a nose. I think the last thing I would show you are my export settings. So if I go to export, I generally go to save for web legacy. And what I do, these are the settings I use here. I save as a JPEG. I save very high. I don't think maximum is necessary, but you can always have it. And I have it on optimized. And of course, since I post mostly on the internet, I use internet standards. This is not really necessary. And then this is where you crop. If you would like to crop, put it on bicubic sharper. And this is where you should crop if you were to do your crops for Instagram. Let's say if I was to do 1080, then this is where you would do the best crop for yourself. I advise you to do most of your cropping here instead. It really maintains the quality of your images, and it gives you something that is not crushed when you export or upload to Instagram.